Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. Where had we left off last week? Well, we had just started to talk about this fellow here, Matteo Ricci, an Italian who joined the Jesuit order, who went to Asia, first to India, eventually ended up in China, and who had a very long and accomplished career as a missionary, as a scientist, in China, and we're going to spend a little bit more time with Matteo Ricci today. Two things that we're actually going to discuss today, highlighted here on the timeline, and that is in 1593, Ricci changes Buddhist garb for Confucian robes. What is that all about? And in 1601, Ricci establishes residence in Beijing. So, we read some letters that Matteo Ricci sent home to friends and colleagues and superiors back in Europe. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of snippets here from things that I thought were really interesting. In one of these letters, he talks about these Spaniards. He says a few Spaniards arrived here, and here is probably Macau, right? The southern coast of China, where the Portuguese, the Jesuits had set up a trade post and a Catholic mission. They reached China coming from the New World. Isn't that fascinating, right? The Portuguese, of course, had come around Africa, but we know that by the 16th century, especially the Spanish are already in the New World, and they came the other way. They came over the Pacific. So they reached China coming from the New World, or Occidental Indies, that for us are the Oriental Indies. They went through many dangers, and we got the Portuguese to allow them to come in under the condition that they will not return. Among them were many Capuchins. Who are they? They are a different Catholic sect, and that is that they are essentially Franciscans. So they are Spanish Franciscan missionaries who came here to work with much fervor, and even a father of ours thinking that China had converted already. Now they are returning on a small boat. We gave them some letters, but we do not know whether they will arrive safely. And then a little lower he says, we are at 22.5 of latitude north, 125 longitude, according to the most precise information. But even though, according to the degrees, we are closer to the west, according to ordinary navigation, we are as far from one side as from the other. As a matter of fact, from here we can reach the New World in 2 months, and from there to here it takes less than 1 year. I pray your reverence not trust the maps of the world, because due to ignorance or disagreement between the kings of Portugal and Spain about the borders, they contain mistakes too huge, mistakes that now will be finally put to rest. So I think there's so much interesting stuff going on in this little snippet, right? One is that we clearly have competition between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and between the Jesuits and the Franciscans, right? So these are, of course, spheres of influence, both in terms of trade and in terms of religion. So you don't want to meddle in each other's territories, right? And of course, the second passage tells us so much about the expanding horizon of the West. And I put the West here in quotation marks because, of course, we're talking about those European powers who for so long had been relegated really to the margins of the world, the known world, the world that matters. And China, of course, had been at the center of that. But, right, as we had discussed in the 15th, 16th century, as, especially Portugal and Spain build up their overseas empire, the West, Europe, is really expanding its horizon. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with maps. So we're going to be talking a lot more about maps. But of course, that ultimately will also lead to a shift, if you want, in political and economic centers. Here's another little snippet. I don't have any more paper. May your reverence very strongly recommend me on your sacrifices. Send my best regards to blah, 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 blah. I think this is just really funny. He's sort of coming to an end. He doesn't have anything else to say. What better excuse than to say, oh, I ran out of paper. Of course, it is possible. And paper, especially, for Europeans, always was, a precious and relatively expensive commodity. As we will see shortly, in China, not so. One last snippet, and this is really interesting, and this is going to get us essentially transition to that first big set of questions we wanted to answer today. China is governed by a single monarch who succeeds by primogeniture. The present ruler, Wan Li, 24 years old, has governed for 12 years. The ruler governs his whole realm through magistrates called mandarins. And they are of two categories. The first to obtain through their own bravery and by succeeding those who first conquered the reign are officers of war. The other category are the mandarins of letters, who are much more important and are superior to those of war. All are divided into 9 grades, and each grade has so many kinds of office that it will take a lot of time for us to understand. So here is a really important term, and that is of mandarins. Who are those mandarins? Now you remember that on the timeline it had said that Ricci changed Buddhist garb for Confucian robes. And what is really meant here is that he started to wear the dress of the literati elites. And a lot of the literati elite essentially were mandarins. So what are mandarins? In Chinese, Guanyuan. And Mandarin, of course, is also a language. It's Guanhua. And it's, of course, also the language that we now usually, refer Chinese, we call Chinese Mandarin. And that is because there was a language that these officials shared that was essentially the dialect of Beijing. At the time, and even today, there are lots and lots of different dialects spoken all over China, and there needed to be a language with which these officials could essentially communicate among themselves, but also, from representatives from all over China. And the language that was adopted was the language of Beijing, because all of these mandarins, for a period of training and service, would have to spend some time of Beijing. So the Beijing dialect essentially became Mandarin, the language of the mandarins, and that is why essentially it ultimately became the standardized language of China that we now call Mandarin. But mandarins, of course, are also the people who essentially ruled the country. So an official in any of the senior grades of the former imperial Chinese civil service. Also, more generally, a similar official in any East Asian country. Now, historical. So this is from the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. Here you have it, the ultimate definition. Now, mandarins were chosen by examination. And as Ricci already told us, there were 9 grades, right? Each of which was distinguished by the material from which the round ornament or button on top of the official headgear was made. So they were wearing special hats, but they also were wearing very special robes. And also this here, on the robes they would wear signs of their office and status. So this is a much later image. This is a 19th century image of a mandarin. But, it probably wouldn't have changed all that much since Ricci's times. Now we said these mandarins were chosen by a series of exams, and here you have a photograph, a 19th century photograph of examination cells for the National Civil Service exams, also known 科举. And this is really extraordinary because essentially what this is we have a government that functions as a meritocracy, meaning you become a government official and you rise through the ranks of the government based on merit, based on how good you are as an official, how good you know what you are supposed to know. Now, the beginning of the Chinese meritocracy as a system of governing goes back to the Song dynasty, the 10th century. But at least since the Ming dynasty's 14th century, it really becomes thoroughly institutionalized. Now, what were these candidates tested on? And this is really interesting and really quite important. So they were generally tested on their knowledge of a set of books that in English we usually refer to as the Confucian classics. Confucius, or Kongzi, I'm sure you have all heard of. He's pretty famous. He is also the most important, or one of the most important Chinese philosophers who thought a lot about how to govern a state. Now, this term Confucianism then refers to the learning that we associate with Confucius. Interestingly, there isn't really a direct Chinese equivalent of what we in the West call Confucianism. In Chinese, this set of learning and this sort of mindset that is associated with Confucianism is usually either referred to as Rujiao, which really just means learning, scholarly learning, or Lijiao, which really refers to rights and ethics. So Confucianism is very much all about rights and rules and moral guidance and ethics, etc. So we can see that Confucius lived about 551 to 479 BCE. The concept of Confucianism becomes really important a little later, especially during the Han Dynasty, which roughly corresponds with the Roman Empire, the height of the Roman Empire. And during that period, a set of texts, the 5 classics, is designated as a curriculum for the imperial academy. So at that time, we don't yet have a meritocracy, but we already have an understanding that if you want to serve in the government, you have to know these texts. And these texts are supposedly edited by Confucius himself, and they include the Classic of Change, the I Ching, the Book of Odes, the Shi Jing. This is really a collection of folk poetry, the Book of History, Shu Jing, and the Book of Rites, Li Ji. And then there is another important, really a historical text called the Spring and Autumn Annals, Chunqiu. Now, over the next 1,000 years, this grows first to a set of 13, and a number of books are added. One of them is Mencius. More about Mencius in a little while. The Classic of Filial Piety. And then during the Song Dynasty, sort of 11th, 12th century, these texts become collated as a fundamental basis of what we usually call Confucianism, this set of texts that lay the foundation for the Chinese bureaucracy, for the Chinese state philosophy, and essentially government, Chinese government. By the 13th century, we have sort of a set of 4 books, which is now the authoritative master canon that you had to master if you wanted to become a successful government official, but also just recognize that, for character formation, for schooling, for preparation for civil service exams, for state philosophy, in short, the things that you needed to know if you wanted to become an accomplished individual. And these 4 texts, and this is important, this is going to be part of the quiz, is the Analects, the Confucian Analects, in Chinese called 论语. The book of Mencius, Mengzi. Mencius was another philosopher a little later than Confucius, but essentially following in Confucius' footsteps. The great learning, 大学, and maintaining perfect balance, also known as the doctrine of the mean. Now, these texts, very interestingly, were first translated into a Western language by Matteo Ricci, and they were first translated into Latin by him. And I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. But now I want to do another little fun thought experiment, okay? So here you see a classical Chinese classroom, okay? So you see a teacher and a few boys, no girls, maybe one girl dressed as a boy because she really wants to study as well, but usually learning was reserved for men, as it was in other societies as well. So let us continue that thought experiment of ours. You are all 7-year-old boys, maybe a couple of girls disguised as boys. You are all related. You're all of the same family clan, essentially, and a wealthy clan elder finances the school that was built by his grandfather, who had been a 进士. And what is a 进士? Well, a 进士is somebody who has passed the highest examination, essentially the palace examination in the capital, that will pave the way to successful government service. And you see, there are quite a few steps that people would have to go through exams that they would need to pass, starting with the Shengyuan, Juren, Gongshi. And usually this process would take at least 15, 20 years. So usually people, once they would become Jinshi maybe in their 40s, if they were lucky. But most people who tried these exams actually didn't make it that far, right? So the fail rate was really, really high. So once you made it to Jinshi, that really said a lot about you. And who am I? Well, I am your teacher who failed to pass most of these exams and who's trying to pass them and who's trying every 2 or every 3 years. The Juren exam is held, a lot of these exams were not held every year. And, often people who were trying for these exams would end up as teachers, or they would end up as hired lower-ranking government officials at a county level, or maybe at the provincial level. But they wouldn't have tenure, so to speak. They would be essentially just hired on a contractual basis, and they wouldn't be real mandarins, so to speak. Okay, so this is our first day of school, and you will probably already have had a little bit of rudimentary teaching before, but today you are really going to start your Confucian education. And the first Confucian text we will study, and very important, memorize, starts like this. 人之初，性本善，性相近，习相远. And you would just speak after me, and we would try to memorize this. 人之初，性本善，性相近，习相远. And we wouldn't necessarily even care so much about the meaning of those words first. We would actually just memorize it. And here it is. So this is what we were just memorizing, right? You have the Chinese text here. 人之初，性本善，性相近，习相远. And this is taken from a text that is called the Three-Character Classic. You probably noticed that all these couplets are arranged in 3 characters. This is probably written in the 13th century. It was used until the late 19th century as a primer for children at school. And what this is really is, it's a distillation of Confucian learning for children. And the opening, the part that we just try to memorize, translates as, people at birth are naturally good. Their natures or characters are similar, yet their habits will become different through studying, right? So it's really through studying and learning that we distinguish ourselves, that our characters become different, because at birth we're all the same. And then it goes on, if negligently not taught or educated, their nature deteriorate. The right way to teach is with absolute concentration. So I put a link to that entire 3-character canon, or 3-character classic, which is actually very short. It's very short. And there is a little reading quiz I want you to do. So I said you're all 6 or 7-year-old boys. You finished your first days of school. We have started to memorize the 3-character classic. And I want you to read as much, actually I'd like to read all of it if you can, of the 3-character classic as you can, and then point out 3 core values or virtues that you think are central to Confucianism and that the book is trying to teach you. Okay, and briefly explain what they are, and quote the appropriate passage, either in English or Chinese. Okay, so put differently, according to the 3-character classic, what is the core of Confucianism? And to give you some more ideas, I want to just read a couple of passages from you from some text that is what is probably the best known, especially abroad, of these Confucian texts, and that's the Confucian Analects, the 论语. And again, we're going to read the opening of that. And then you have the Chinese on top, and then you have the English. Let's just read the first line in Chinese. 自曰学而时习之，不亦乐乎？有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎？人不知而不愠，不亦君子乎? And this translates as, the master said, to learn something and timely practice it or review it, isn't that a pleasure? Is it not delightful to have friends coming from distant quarters? Is he not a man of complete virtue? And highlighted in yellow the word 君子, which is sort of a key term in Confucianism. A man of complete virtue who feels not discomposure though men may take no note of him. And then it continues like this. 柚子 said, these are, disciples of Confucius, there are few who have developed themselves filially and fraternally, who enjoy offending their superiors. Put differently, those who do not enjoy offending superiors are never troublemakers. The noble man concerns himself with the fundamentals. Once the fundamentals are established, the proper way appears. Are not filial piety and obedience to elders fundamental to the actualization of fundamental human goodness? Right? So you see that there is a focus on learning, on self-refinement, on becoming a responsible member of the community who observes rights and ethics, who observes rules like filiality, that is, to be obedient and polite to your parents and to your elders and maybe to your rulers, essentially of observing certain relationships. By the way, on the bottom here, we have actually an excerpt of that Latin translation that was initiated by the Jesuits. Let's quickly look at one more text, and that is the opening of Mencius, the book of Mencius. And Mencius, as a philosopher, he would visit rulers and offer advice. And most of that advice was about how to govern a country, how to be a successful ruler. And here he tells us this. The king said, "Venerable sir, since you have not counted it too far to come here a distance of 1,000 li, may I presume that you are provided with counsels to profit my kingdom?" Mencius replied, "Why must your majesty use the word profit? What I am provided with are counsels to benevolence and righteousness. And these are my only topics. If your majesty say, 'What is to be done to profit my kingdom?' the great officers will say, 'What is to be done to profit our families?' And the inferior officers and the common people will say, 'What is to be done to profit our persons?' Superiors and inferiors will try to snatch this profit, the one from the other, and the kingdom will be endangered. There never has been a benevolent man who neglected his parents. There never has been a righteous man who made his sovereign an after consideration. Let your majesty also say benevolence and righteousness, and let these be your only themes. Why must you use the word profit?" And you see that profit here is used with a very negative connotation, this idea of either profiting yourself financially or gaining a profit, a benefit over others, right? And Mencius says, if you put benevolence and righteousness and rights and good behavior above everything else, everybody will follow you. Everybody will aspire to these same high principles, right? So essentially he gives advice for how the realm should be ruled. Lead by example, promote benevolence and righteousness, and act as an enlightened ruler. And I put enlightened here in quotation marks because this word or this notion of an enlightened ruler is something that philosophers in the West would pick up about 100 years later, and we will discuss this in a couple of weeks, but the origin for this idea of the enlightened ruler has very much to do with the way the Jesuits interpreted Confucian classics and the way the Jesuits portrayed the bureaucracy and the way the Chinese Empire was governed back to Europeans. And here at the bottom you have another page from that Jesuit translation of the Confucian classics. And the name Confucius, and Mencius likewise, is actually a Latinized version of Mengzi and Kongzi. So the reason we call them Confucius and Mencius is really because of the Jesuits. Okay, wow, this was a long lecture. I'm going to try to keep the second one a little shorter. Real quick, if you want to read a little bit more about Confucianism, I put a link to a wonderful, very short book on our iLearn site. It's called Confucianism, A Very Short Introduction. If you don't know this series, A Very Short Introduction, let me give you a very short introduction to the series, A Very Short Introduction. It's out of Oxford University Press. There are hundreds of titles, and they cover pretty much any discipline you might imagine. They're usually written by the authority in that discipline, and they essentially distill what you really need to know about this subject. So Confucianism, A Very Short Introduction, is a really, really excellent introduction to the topic of Confucianism. And here on the right, you have a page from a early print edition, probably 13th century, of the Analects of Confucius with commentaries in small print there. And I'll leave it at that, and I will see you shortly for our second course stream.